everybody, it's T. Falcon Napier. Joining me as always, Dave Miller. Say hi, Dave.
Hi, everybody.
We are in the midst of Lesson 5. Lesson 5 is about energies and resonance, are the two concepts that we're covering in this lesson that matter the most. But it comes from a series of deeper, what we call enrichment lessons that we did that you guys certainly can all go and watch or / listen to expand your knowledge base. But those were on the subjects of comparative human typological analysis, the merging of brilliance, maps of humanity, and finally this energies and resonance that we really are focusing on. So what we did last time around was I started talking a little bit about where these models of human behavior have come from that we've integrated into the single model we refer to as the change grid. And we started talking about the quadrant-based personality typing systems and how those different quadrant-based personality typing systems would seek to divide the world into 4 different types and then describe each one of those types sufficiently that the reader would resonate with one and not so much the others. And they all have different front end tests that you take and different back end ways of applying whatever that those insights happen to be. But fundamentally, the types that they are all describing, those 4 types, overlay on everybody else's 4 types. They change the label, they change a little bit of the front ends and back ends, but nevertheless, these 4 types end up becoming the same. Now, as I said last time around, and I will no doubt repeat another dozen times before we're done, we do not do personality typing. We don't talk about temperaments. We don't talk about preferences. We simply say that using these insights gained from so many models that have been merged together in that act of merging of brilliance, we can better understand how a person happens to be responding to a particular activity at a particular moment in time. And so rather than thinking about these stopping points as types, we instead think of them as being energies. And last time around, we talked about those 4 primary types. We went over a lot of adjectives. And when we left off, we said that each one of these types ends up with a set of adjectives that are relatively positive and a set of adjectives that's relatively negative. And then I threw out the question, are we supposed to believe that everyone who is of that type is experiencing all of those adjectives simultaneously? Well, obviously the answer is that'd be absurd, so no. So we said, all right, then under what circumstances are one or more of these adjectives going to become predominant and the other ones are going to be subordinated? So what was going on? And we start talking about how the relatively negative adjectives tend to move into increasingly specific locations on the change grid itself. And that's this layer you're looking at right now. These 4 red triangles are referred to as danger zones. And there is an up grid, an out grid, a down grid, and an in grid danger zone. And if we look at the different relatively negative adjectives that were used to describe what's going on with that type when it's under duress or under some extreme set of circumstances, we find that all of those adjectives tend to migrate into that danger zone. Now, if you look at the danger zone, you'll see that inside of the danger zone, there's still multiple points that we could be addressing. And so are we supposed to believe that all of these adjectives appear everywhere inside of this wedge? No. Some of them are going to be moved further and further up or out or down or in, depending on which one of the danger zones we're looking at. And so ultimately, the resource tool that we'll point all of you to is called the Comprehensive Adjective Map. And this is something that I'll provide links to in the Student Resource Center. The Comprehensive Adjective Map shows a very detailed map of well over 1,000 adjectives, and the specific adjective, or rather a coordinate pair where those adjectives come forward. So anyway, so there's a danger zone. Now, if you're in the upgrade danger zone, in all likelihood, you are experiencing more than one of these particular adjectives, depending on where you're at. And so we can work our way around the change grid and look at the other danger zones to see what's going on. Yes,
See,
Dave. Yep.
question on the upgrade danger zone. The one adjective that kind of stuck out to me, it was egotistical. And I
Yeah.
would associate that probably more with an outgrid danger zone. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that a lot of the adjectives that are appearing in the danger zones, or more accurately, a lot of the relatively negative adjectives that people who do typing systems have used to describe that type on its bad day, ends up putting together this collective of adjectives. And some of these adjectives, I believe, are responses that someone is having to whatever the situation happens to be. And other times, I think they're coping mechanisms. So
Hmm.
they're ways of defending themselves. So, for example, in order to end up in the upgrade danger zone, I would have to rate my level of ability as being very low and the challenge
Hmm.
as being very high. Well, if you put yourself in a situation where you view your ability as being very, very low and the challenge as being very, very high, you may come across as being very frightened and impulsive and overactive. But let's say that you knew that you were being judged in that moment. Others were observing you and were somehow or another assessing your way of coping. You may come across then as being, how about egotistical? How about let's
Intimidating, maybe.
intimidating, right? Manipulative,
Hmm.
obnoxious. But it's more a way of the way you are presenting yourself, rather than revealing what you're truly feeling. So we could say underneath that egotistical behavior is insecurity. There
Mm.
is the
Okay.
fear, or whatever the upgrade emotion happens to be that's causing this. So the other thing that I'll bring to everyone's attention is that the people who develop these personality maps, with all due respect and love to every single one of them, have blinders on. They are trying directly, indirectly, consciously, unconsciously to get something to fit. And as they try to force something to fit into a static diagram, they end up encountering these challenges with labels that don't really seem to apply or don't seem to make sense. The change grid is not a static tool. It's a dynamic representation of the full range of behaviors, options, beliefs, whatever, that humans have available to them. And so we're going to do something that to me is very simple but very powerful in understanding and resolving where these odd adjectives seem to resolve themselves. And so let's set that aside for a few moments and we'll work our way through the rest of these and you'll see how it's all coming together. In
Great,
fact,
thanks.
you'll see some of these adjectives are going to appear in multiple locations because remember, this whole act of merging of brilliance um, was about using multiple maps. I mean, honestly, hundreds of different maps of of humanity, and some developers put that adjective one place, and others put it someplace else. So even they couldn't agree where it all goes. And again, rewinding to what my personal belief is that anyone's map who seems to be mostly right, if it gets integrated with everybody else's maps that seem mostly right, these issues get shaken out. So they resolve themselves. Clarity comes forward, and so I'll show you all where that clarity has come from. So all right, anyway, there's an outgrid danger zone, and then you see these. Notice manipulative is there as well. So is egocentric, not egotistical, egocentric. I thought that was interesting. And there's a lot. You go down grid, and we still have a lot of these relatively negative um, um, adjectives appearing there. In grid, we see them as well. So you get the idea. You can spend all kinds of time playing with this to really understand it, but or to better understand the adjectives and where they lie. But let's resolve the issue. The way we resolve this issue is to look at these at this particular layer. This is simply showing you that there are certain geographical landmarks on the change grid that end up being very useful. And so in the center of the change grid, we have what we refer to as the PowerPoint. And we've been using the term PowerPoint longer than Microsoft has been in business. And so someday I should probably send them a note. But the PowerPoint is the exact center of the change grid. It is a place of tremendous empowerment, but there's a lot of very interesting things that happen there as well. We'll get into in greater detail. And by the way, again, this is a program about coaching, and so I think it's important for you to know and to help your clients understand what a PowerPoint experience feels like. Because again, it's not about their personality type, it's about a moment that is readily available to them anytime they choose to access it. So the PowerPoint ends up becoming a very useful, practical, powerful place for us to be whenever we are trying to accomplish certain things. And so to have that ability to move ourselves energetically to the PowerPoint is an extremely powerful ability. Now, similarly, there are these four red spots that you're going to look at. Those four red spots are called powerless points. When the danger zone reaches its most extreme, the person is no longer in danger. Their energy is no longer exposing them to a dangerous situation. That energy is now rendering them quite powerless indeed. So we can talk about not only the outgrid danger zone, but the outgrid powerless points, which is when the worst of these negative adjectives holds true. And similarly, you can see in the downgrid danger zone, there's a downgrid powerless point, and the in-grid danger zone is an in-grid powerless point, and upgrid is an upgrid one. So this should serve as no surprise to come as no surprise to any of you that are going through this program. Here's the surprising point. In truth, there are not four powerless points. There is only one. And so all four of these powerless points are in fact the exact same point. We just get to that point of powerlessness from four primary directions. So here's the best way to envision this. So I want you for just a moment to in your mind, take this diagram that you're looking at and print it out on a piece of fabric, on a handkerchief. And then take that piece of fabric, so each one of these corners is a corner of that handkerchief. Take this handkerchief and lay it on top of a ball. I don't care if it's a baseball, softball, soccer ball, whatever. You take this and you drape it on top of a ball, so that the PowerPoint is actually at the very top. So we'll call that the North Pole. And these four corners drape down the sides of the ball. Now, if you gave each one of those corners a bit of a tug, you could stretch them to the point that they all meet at the bottom of that ball at the South Pole. And so these four seemingly different points can in fact all merge on top of one another and become one spot. That then means that each of those four danger zones, that when we depict the change grid as a two-dimensional diagram, seem to be so far apart, are in fact direct neighbors, physically adjacent to one another. And so it's not a big stretch to understand that a lot of those negative adjectives that don't seem to fit in one spot would fit in another one of these extremes. And it's so easy for a person energetically to move from one of those danger zones to its neighboring danger zone, because they really are close to one another. So hopefully you guys were able to make that manipulation in your mind to turn what seems to be a two-dimensional diagram into a three-dimensional representation, a sphere that helps to explain how these adjectives that seem so distant from one another and overlap in ways that you go, what's that all about? Hopefully that brings clarity to it. One last thing I'll tell you is that there is a reference tool that you'll have available to you in the Student Resource Center. It's called The Dark Side of the Change Grid. It is a graphic representation of the four danger zones from the comprehensive adjective map being placed adjacent to one another. So you can really see what's going on in the worst case scenario for the client's energies. Dave, thoughts about that? Questions about that from anyone?
Yeah, it's I love that illustration, by the way. That really helps me conceive the dynamic there. It's interesting when you think about the outgrid powerless point. In essence, as we move from the power point outgrid, that you think, okay, power is increasing, right? And intensity is increasing, but you get to a point where that increases so much it becomes powerless.
Yes.
And that's a little bit hard to understand. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So, okay, we all know if you look at your reference tool about the levels of productive tension, we all know that the power point and the outgrid powerless point, I mean, technically even the end-grid, but the outgrid powerless point are both in power. So what happens is that as someone moves further and further outgrid in power, the way their power is being experienced and exhibited to others changes. As Dave said, their intensity it changes. So let's think about that. Let's look at the coordinates. If you're in a situation where you view your ability as being moderate, but the challenge of the task is only being moderate as well. Ability and challenge are in balance with one another. And so your mind is basically saying, all right, well, it's relatively, it's somewhat challenging, but I'm capable of matching that. So I'm okay. I'm good. I'm in power, ready to do it. Feeling confident, proactive, all those things you learned about power are happening. Now, as I move further and further out grid, something starts to change. So let's go halfway. I believe my ability is a 9, a relatively high level of ability, but the challenge that I'm facing is also a 9, a relatively high level of challenge. Now, the test just became that much more difficult. Now it feels a little bit more like I've got to prove something. I've got to step up, show up, got to make it all happen. A test is afoot. So there's a higher level of risk involved, perhaps even a higher potential for a return on your success. But that feeling of being at 9.9 is different than the feeling of being at 6.6. Well, in fact, it's different than being at 8.8 or 7.7 or any other of these coordinate pairs you really want to look at. So even then, that's a good spot. This is where a person is going to stretch themselves, be fully engaged, go out there, give it a try, do their very best and succeed. Now let's go further out grid. In fact, let's go to say a 10-10. Now we start looking a little bit about how an Olympic athlete must feel when they are they know that they are a contender to be up on that medal platform. How would they rate their ability to perform whatever their sport happens to be? Of course, they're going to believe it's really, really high, but the smartest among them know that there's still ways to improve. As far as challenge goes, they know it's not easy or everybody would do it. In fact, they know that it's hard enough that only a handful of people on the entire planet can even compete against them in with a chance to win. And so they're going like, this is not going to be easy. I am up against every other medal contender, but I believe I got the ability to do it. So I got to make sure I'm on top of it. I'm doing absolutely everything that I can possibly do. And so that coordinate pair 10-10, which would be right at the edge of the danger zone, is a place where we may very well find greatness, a place where people are powerfully executing on whatever their action plan happens to be. Everything is falling very much into place, ready, willing, able to tackle the challenge that they know is before them. So this is a place where perhaps true excellence, true greatness is actually experienced by clients, by people. But if we go further out grid, that confidence starts to become arrogance. that bravery becomes bravado. And the person starts to feel and present themselves as someone who is not subject to the limits of physical reality. They are no longer a hero, they think they're a superhero. And so they willingly step into harm's way. And sometimes they succeed because sadly, a great deal of that bravado and that arrogance ends up being reinforced because they do end up having sufficient success. But when they do fall, and they fall very, very hard. In fact, very often, they immediately jump from the out-grid danger zone to the in-grid danger zone. And now they start feeling sorry for themselves and they feel as though no one understands them, blah, blah, blah. So there's all kinds of interesting things that happen as someone moves into that danger zone where we start seeing words like being a bully, bossy, brutal, condescending, judgmental, manipulative, threatening, boorish. There's all kinds of adjectives we found out there. And so there are a lot of people that are in the outgrid danger zone, very capable individuals, but for whatever reason, it's gotten a bit out of control. And now they're coming across as being very abrasive. Now, those of you that do executive level coaching and you are providing coaching to people who are being groomed for leadership positions at the executive ranks, know that this can be a real problem. There are a lot of people in senior positions who carry themselves as though the sun rises and sets on them, who are capable of doing nothing wrong, who have no peer. And we all know that underlying that behavior is a lot of insecurity. Until we can help that person become comfortable enough to stop presenting this facade to us, we can actually be of service to them. But if we are only allowed to meet and deal with the facade, the chances of us actually having any real hope of helping this individual to become more of the person they need to become to be successful in the role they're looking at, what's the point? So they need humility and that. And so, you can, I'll throw it back to you, Dave. I'm sure as an executive coach, you've had more than your fair share of people who are existing in the outgrid danger zone and what happens when they do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what happens is that they lose their leadership power because people see it and they don't really respect them. And unfortunately, those people usually don't reveal that to them explicitly. It's more behind the back kind of things that happen.
Right.
Um, Now, your explanation of this reminds me of something. We always say there's a thin line between a bully and a coward, right? So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
it's kind of
Yep.
like slipping from that outgrid danger zone to into the powerless point where you're going from
Mhm.
outgrid to ingrid in a
Yeah.
moment's time,
Right.
and
Yeah.
to represent that.
And I know this is really, we do consider this to be a rather advanced concept in the world of tension management. I mean, honestly, I think it's both beautiful and terrifying at the same moment that we're even talking about this concept's existence. Nevertheless, it's come up, so let us be in the moment. So it is true that as someone moves further and further outgrid, they enter the outgrid danger zone, they reach this outgrid powerless point, they are becoming more and more aggressive. And that aggressive behavior often presents itself as being bullying behavior. In fact, often you would find behaviors being perpetrated upon others in this. So there's this very um, when I'm talking about aggressive, I could be including in that physically aggressive behaviors. I could be talking about truly profoundly abusive behaviors of all forms. Um, and so what ends up happening is that as that person moves further and further outgrid, and they start to experience the negative most consequences of that behavior. So let's say they're caught. It's interesting how quickly that outgrid danger zone person or moment. Okay, and I have to always catch and correct myself because we get lazy with language, and that's where problems occur. This is not a person. I mean, yeah, maybe their behavior is being so consistently exhibited that we end up using a label to describe the person at their essence as being this outgrid, danger zone, bully, boorish, horrible, aggressive monster. But if you really embrace the concepts that are being presented here in tension management, but the truth is that that behavior that we're observing is something that is being displayed at that particular moment in time, specific to whatever the activity happens to be. It is not an essential part of the person's makeup. It's simply how they happen to be responding. Now, all that said, if that person responds in that way for enough hours of a given day, day after day after day after day, one should not be surprised to find out they get labeled as being that type of person, instead of recognizing that's how they happen to be responding to or coping with whatever is really going on in their full internal environment. And I'm talking about, obviously, the internal environment of their mind. So what happens is that if we take that horrible bully and confront them about their behavior, it's interesting, as Dave alluded to, how quickly they choose to present themselves, or could choose to present themselves, as someone who's actually in the in-grid danger zone. They don't know any better. They're not the perpetrator, they're the victim. Nobody understands them. This is how they were always treated, and all they're doing is exhibiting the same sorts of behaviors that they were subjected to. So they're really, they don't know any better. They didn't mean any harm. No one understands them. No one understands the pressures of their, and suddenly they start to display those in-grid danger zone behaviors about being very timid, being very withdrawn, and whatever. So it's very interesting how you can watch these people appear to swing to the other extreme when in truth it wasn't a big swing at all. They simply moved to an adjacent danger zone. And by the way, it's not always out-grid to in-grid. Out-grid could also move up-grid, and suddenly they become explosively emotional, frantic, desperate, clinging for any lifeline anyone throws to them. Or they may decide to retreat altogether into the down-grid danger zone, where they go from being this bully, bossy, whatever, to being very aloof, lethargic, bored, detached, ambivalent, whatever. So from actively caring to passive, actively not caring to passively not caring.
Hmm.
So yeah, anyway, and if you really wanted to have some fun with this, really lock it in. For years and years, we had a discussion group with of people who, for whatever reasons, didn't just use the concept of tension management in their work, but they really like thinking about thinking. And so we would choose whatever some current affair happens to be and try to explain what's going on with this current event, what's going on with the people that are part of this current event in terms of movement on the change grid. So who's out grid, who's up grid, who just moved from where to where, who's trying to move whom from where to where. So what's really going on, and I genuinely believe this, we could really graph out every single thing that's happening on this planet at this very moment in time can be better understood if it can be depicted on the change grid and can be discussed and described in terms of location and movement across the change grid. Because again, we're talking about the energy that a human has about a particular situation and how that energy ends up, coming to be and then impacting whatever their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors are, moving from whatever that current response happens to be. So I don't know if I should say to all of the students on the call, congratulations, you just got a glimpse into the advanced world of tension management, or if I should apologize profusely for perhaps adding an element that might feel a little bit confusing. Don't allow it to be confusing. It's just new, and if you just let it settle into place, it'll all make a very clear sense in due time.
I think
So
it's good stuff, T.
yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the people who like thinking about thinking, who really like the concepts of tension management and like to play with how it really does apply, uh, that's fascinating. That's where the crazy conversations begin. So
Right.
yeah, there's a lot to it. A lot to it. Amazing what happens when you take over 400 models of human behavior and merge them into one, and then say those aren't static; those are dynamic. And now it becomes a living, breathing thing.
Hmm.
Okay, so with that, wow, we start. I will tell you without getting into it that the change grid can be divided into many different graphic representations depending on the model. So, for example, a lot of those quadrant-based personality typing systems said, there really is a fifth type. It's when you are equal parts of all of these, or you're the best of all of these, and then so let's add a fifth one right in the middle. Okay, and some said, well, there are these four main types, but for each pair of those four types, there's an in-betweener. So maybe there aren't four types. Maybe what there really are eight different types we can look at. And some of the popular eight type models use language like this. They use colors. Red, so upgrid was the inspirer or the yellow type, and outgrid was the director or the red type. Well, if you go halfway in between, you end up color-wise with orange. But what's halfway between being an inspirer and a director? So you're not quite as directive as a director, but you're a little bit more active than just being inspiring. Okay, now you're a motivator, because a motivator basically takes inspiration, starts to put it into action, but they aren't running the show. They're not the boss of the bus. And then you look at the downgrade possibilities, or this section of it. We got the director again, who likes to just run things. But downgrade, we had that observer, the highly, in other words, you'll see used as the analytical type. This is the person whose ability is extremely high, perceived challenge is quite low. They've mastered it, so they observe it, they understand it. So, but they don't necessarily always do something with it. Sometimes they like to watch things just for the sake of watching them, and they gather insights and understanding purely for the joy of having insights and understanding. They don't really necessarily feel compelled to do anything about that. But in between the observer and the director is this reformer. The reformer says, I've observed this and something must be done. I've observed this and we have an opportunity for change. So they start to throw in a little bit of that director energy, and they decide to try to put those observations into some sort of action for change to occur. So again, if we view these as being personality types, we're going to be very restricted in how we can actually use this to help people most powerfully. But if we go, no, their energy changes. So right now, if I've got someone who has made an observation, I'm working with a client and they have this amazing insight, they feel this insight is really very clear to them, and we start to talk to them and they go like, yeah, we could really do something about this. Now we start hearing that reformer energy start to come into play, and maybe at some point in time, in order for that change to occur, they might need to even move their energy up even more, upgrid and outgrid, and become a little bit more of the energy that's driving that initiative. Along the way, an effective director, or the person who's driving it, this leader type that might be very far out grid, may find times they need to be motivating their people. And so hopefully you guys can see, as we start to apply some of these labels and look at this different energy map here, that we really are just looking at the myriad ways that humans can operate. Thoughts about that, Dave?
No, it's really interesting to look at that combination, and it also helps with art class because I always forget primary colors. So
There you go. And obviously, we go to the other side about the coordinator, supporter, helper, inspirer. Point is, there are many, many, many models of human behavior that try to describe humanity into eight types. Not surprisingly, and by the way, those of you who are fluent in Myers-Briggs, there is a layer of the change grid that all 16 Myers-Briggs archetypes will overlay. But we can even say inside of the Myers-Briggs topology, there are these four different contributing, I'm going to use the word energies. And so those energies, whether you're going to be um, an extroverted or introverted energetically, or you're a thinker or a feeler, an intuitive, or all the other choices that are out there, you can see where they overlay on here, where those energies start to show forward. So like a director would be extroverted thinking tends to be more outgrid, where introverted thinking more downgrid. Reformers are just thinking, they're in between. So anyway, it's kind of fun to see how it all overlays. Not surprisingly, all the people who were advocates of 8-type systems said, maybe there's a ninth. Maybe there's one in the middle, which is the best of all these, or a balance. Maybe, let's have 9. And now you get into, actually, it was an advanced development in the disk profile. I think it was called disk cards. And in
Mm.
disk cards, they created these 9 types. And so there was a driver, a communicator, a planner, and an analyst. Those of you that are fluent in disk can probably dig through all of your different resource materials. And you might even find that someone came along, I believe they were independent, and they were creating a tool based on disk that they thought would be of greater practical application, and they ended up with these disk cards. They had 9 of them. So they said, if you are, you're halfway between driver and communicator, that's where the assertive way of responding applies. So the type was driver, the type was communicator, but in between the behavior was assertive. Or maybe you were halfway between driver and analyst, now it was controlled, and it goes around. And if you're in the middle, you were balanced. So I thought, okay, that's very interesting. They were not alone. There were many 9-type systems. This one I find quite interesting. This is the Leonard type. Is that correct? This is Leonard. And Leonard was actually the most popular personality typing system available in Malaysia and the whole Asian realm over there. And so, and before you think that's minor, no. Most of the population of the world is over there. And so a very popular model. And Leonard, if you spelled out his name, was Leonard, and the L was, he had a little acronym. L was for let's, and E was for explore, and then he used his name to spell the rest. It was neutral, Leo, oh no, open, neutral, analytical, relational, decisive. So he had these 5 types that we was talking about. So the decisive type are decisive. They like to win. They're bold. The analytical type, cautious, likes to be precise, can work alone. And you see relational, full of life, persuasive, convincing. But in between these, he said that the type ended up displaying itself behaviorally. And you could be action oriented if you were halfway between decisive and relational. If you were halfway between decisive, that's where task orientation, data orientation, people orientation. So you see the 9 different areas. Now, again, each one of these models had merit as a standalone, but when you begin to merge them with everyone else's models, greater and greater layers of insight, clarity, usefulness come into play. But again, we aren't using this, and the vast majority, contrary to what the vast majority of them did, we don't use this to type people. We just say, depending on where you fall in the change grid, X will hold true. So I promise you, on the change grid, if you plot or your ability is moderately high to very high, but the challenge is moderate to, just plain moderate, you're going to be very task oriented. I promise you, this holds true if an activity is plotting in this area. And absolutely, if you're up here, by the way, if I overlaid the 5 levels of tension, action-oriented is a whole lot of power stress. Power stress is where people sound like this: I know I need to do something. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it right now. And so it's very interesting, though, all that action orientation labeling holds true. And so I bring all this up for all of you to better understand something that I genuinely believe about all of you. All of your existing knowledge base when it comes to understanding humanity will prove to be very useful to you as you become higher and higher skilled, more and more fluent in the principles of tension management. We're just mobilizing that knowledge base in a different and we believe more powerful way. And so that's what this is really all about. Okay, thoughts about that, Dave?
No,
All
more
right.
good stuff.
Okay, so now those of you who are have a background in the Enneagram diagram itself doesn't overlay on the change grid because it takes a very unique shape to it. Nevertheless, the seven or rather the nine different types, the nine different points that one could explore in the Enneagram will overlay, as will the labels that they've used for that. So, point number 8, for example, the boss, the leader, the maverick, the protector, the intimidator. And so you'll see a lot of these hold on true. By the way, point 6, devil's advocate, skeptic, guardian, pessimist. One of the adjectives on the adjective map that happens right here on the adjective map, right where I'm pointing right now, is frustration and resentment, a feeling of being held back by people and situations. So if we have a client who views their ability as being extremely high, but kind of views themselves as being stuck doing tasks that are only moderately challenging. So they're feeling underutilized, overprepared, overqualified, not noticed, not recognized, not leveraged. It is not at all surprising that we would find themselves in a moment where they are feeling frustrated, perhaps resentful, held back by people and situations. So this is one of the things that most definitely happens at this particular part of the change grid. So the pessimist comes into play, skeptic. There's a lot of that energy going on as well. Now, again, this particular model is using perhaps 7 or 8 adjectives to describe each one of these. The adjective map contains hundreds of adjectives at each one of these at specific locations, broken up across specific locations. And again, there is an enrichment webinar series you can all go through about the adjective map in detail. Okay, we can also divide the change grid then into 16 different sections. And there are a lot of models who say there are only 4 types. But inside of each one of those 4 types, there are 4 possibilities for what your secondary type might be. And that secondary type might express itself given a certain set of circumstances. And so it's really interesting as you start to, instead of looking at it as 16 different types, view it as 4 primary types, and each one of them having 4 secondary types, which are built of elements of the original 4 types. So to help that make the greatest amount of sense, I will show you a layer that we actually use in the change grid and use the labels that we actually use as we are talking about the 16 energies that someone can have around a particular activity. So we'll start by looking at the 4 quadrants. So out here, the out grid quadrant, out grid, and up here, the more yellowish background is the up grid, the more greenish background in grid, more bluish background down grid. Now, we could use one of these words to describe the primary energy that the person has around it. These energies come from social styles, and we happen to use this language only because we find the 4 labels to be the most conversational, the most readily clear what that particular energy is all about. So outgrid, the primary energy is shown in all capital letters, driver. The driver energy is driven to do something. So the driver energy is trying to accomplish something. And so any of the personality typing systems you know about, what you know to describe the outgrid of their 4 types will hold true here. So yeah. And then upgrid is where the primary energy is expressive. The expressive energy wants to feel something. It wants to display those feelings. It wants to share those feelings. And expressing itself, it likes that energy resonates with others expressing themselves. And so it's all about feeling something and sharing what those feelings might end up being. That's what that expressive energy is all about. The amiable energy is what the primary energy is for in-grid. And the amiable energy is all about caring about something, generally about people and issues that impact people. And the analytical energy, down-grid, that's primary, all in caps, analytical, wants to know something, wants to understand something. And so as I start to work my way around, I can just summarize it by saying the driver energy wants to do something. And notice I didn't say the driver person. The driver energy wants to do something. They want to go somewhere. So they're driven to make something happen. The driver energy wants to do something. The expressive energy wants to feel something. The amiable energy wants to care, and the analytical energy wants to know. So do, feel, care, know. These are the four primary energies. We'll be talking about driver, expressive, amiable, analytical. But now we'll take a look at the out-grid quadrant, and you'll see it's divided into four sub-quadrants. And each one of those subquadrants is further labeled with a secondary energy, shown with a capital letter as the first and everything else lowercase. In your advanced training, you will learn about tertiary energies as well, which are shown in all lowercase letters. So let's look at what is furthest outgrid. The furthest outgrid energy would be described as the driven driver. So we know they're a driver, they want to do something. The secondary energy tells us how they are pursuing whatever their primary objective happens to be. In the case of the driven driver, they are a driver, so they want to do something, but they're a driven driver. So how they want to do something is by making it happen, pushing, driving it, force, force, force. So they do it by doing it. So the driven driver energy focused wholly on the task, moving forward, making it all happen. Now that driven driver energy, if you want to add what you learned a while ago about the danger zone, if I drew a line vertically through the driven driver subquadrant, you would end up with, to the right, the outgrid danger zone, and to the left, the most powerful, engaged, executing energy there is. So the driven driver on its good day is making great things happen, checking off the boxes, accomplishing, getting all kinds of wonderful stuff happening. On their bad day, the driven driver is so focused that they become abrasive, so focused they become aggressive, they become threatening, domineering, dominating. This is where wars are fought, where battles ensue, where someone is going to succeed, but many are going to fall victims by the wayside. This is a messy, dangerous, bloody kind of area that it can happen. And again, pardon me, if you apply this energetically to your work with clients, you may very well be working with someone who, in fact, if they took a personality test, might even test out as someone who's one of these very driven, dominant sorts of types. And we know on their good day, they get great, great things happening. And on a bad day, ooh, there's a mess to be cleaned up. There's some real collateral damage happening. In fact, we say that the driven driver likes risk so much that they create risk where it doesn't exist purely to make things more interesting. They stir up trouble purely for the joy of stirring up trouble. They become confrontational and aggressive purely for the sport of it. And so it ends up becoming a very interesting, challenging, and potentially dangerous energy to be working with. But again, I'm locking it in as best as I can for all of you. We're talking about an energy they have around it. Now, the expressive driver, that's right here, And again, to get there, moderately high ability or moderate ability leaning towards the high side, but a high challenge situation brings out the expressive driver energy. The expressive driver energy is definitely a driver. They want to do something. They want to make something happen. But how do they go about making that thing happen? It's by adding that expressive energy, adding an element of feeling to the whole situation. So this is where passions might be expressed, where motivating messages and behaviors arise, where that inspiring sorts of behavior do that. So they love to move people. So they want to make something happen, but they do it by displaying enthusiasm, passion, inspiring people, motivating people, awakening some beautiful forward-moving energy in front of people. So this is a very inspiring, motivating, energizing kind of an energy. Keep in mind, they're not in a danger zone. So this is that driver energy, again, expressing itself in a very positive and powerful kind of way. It happens to be expressive in its secondary energy. So very outwardly enthusiastic, inspirational, motivating, whatever other words you might want to put there. The amiable driver, oh, by the way, an expressive driver would be, well, I'll do a little fun thing by the time we're finished here today, where I'm going to give you 4 different roles inside of an executive team and tell me which one you would put where. So the amiable driver is a driver. No mistake about it. They want to make something happen. But how they go about making it happen is by adding that amiable energy. The amiable energy wants to care about something. So I'm going to move a situation forward, my driver energy, by caring very deeply about whatever the mission happens to be. And so the amiable driver is a person who, in that moment, energetically again, is being driven by the vision to have impact on others. So they want to make a difference. They want to factor in that there are people involved. There are people that are being impacted. There are people at the heart of everything. So even if we're describing someone who's inside of a sales organization, and they're all drivers. If they're at the top, they're trying to build this organization. You know, this is a profit-making company. How this particular energy wants to move it forward is by making sure we're staying focused on the customer, focused on the employees. So let's make sure we've got a great culture. We've got a very supportive, inclusive environment. We are trying to bring out the best in other people, cultivating their talents and expanding their horizons, etc. So now they're not the big cheerleader like the expressive driver energy would end up being, but they're very much focused on people, caring about what's going on, and making sure we got the right people, the right training, the right support, the right recognition, because with that we can do great, great, great things. The analytical driver is the 4th energy we would find in this out-grid quadrant. The analytical driver is first and foremost a driver. They want to make something happen, but they want to make something happen by applying that analytical energy to it in its secondary position. The analytical energy wants to know something. In fact, an analytical driver generally does know something. They want the facts and figures. They want to build strong strategic plans. They want to figure out the processes, the strategy. They want to know what's going on. And so they get to where they're going by building those plans, executing those plans, following through on that plan. So everything you could put in there about analytical behaviors, they know their stuff, they know the facts, they've got the details, they know how to put things in the right order, they know how to follow through on that order. That's what's going on with the analytical driver. Now, in order for an organization to move forward most effectively, I would say to you that all 4 of these energies we've been talking about end up bringing value. Um, but they are each distinctive enough energies that they resonate very well with one section of that master set of behaviors we need this leadership team to be displaying. And so if I said to you, one of these 4 types we've been talking about is where the COO belongs. one's the CFO, one's the CEO, and one's the chairman. So where would we overlay those four? So now again, we have to be general. We have to think about, well, what is it that a chairman does and is expected to do? What does a CEO do that's unique to what the role as a CEO? Because a lot of them will carry multiple titles. So we've got chairman and CEO. We also have small organizations where the person who's in charge has to be all four of these things. So it's really more which of these four energies needs to be mobilized is based on what is the specific task at hand. So certain tasks that we would attribute to the executive suite would resonate very much with the expressive driver energy, but would probably not be done as effectively with the driven driver energy behind it. Certain behaviors, certain situations lend themselves very much to the amiable driver energy or the analytical driver energy. So which goes where ends up becoming the question. So you want to throw out a guess? What might go where? Can you place any one of them anywhere?
Um, yeah, I'll play. I think the one that is easiest for me would be the CFO because I think of the CFOs as being very analytical. So I put
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
person at the analytical driver.
Yep.
Um,
Can you imagine if the company's finances were being governed by an expressive driver?
yeah, it'd be interesting.
That would be a very different outcome. So,
Right, exactly.
as you can imagine, the expressive energy, it does not really put very heavy emphasis on analytical issues. And likewise, the analytical energy probably looks at the expressive energy and kind of goes like, what is all this feeling for? I mean, it is what it is. So, yeah.
No, you threw me off with the other three because I thought you were going to say CFO, CEO, COO, and HR. And
Oh, well,
I
but
had them down, but
right, but let's say, okay, well, I can still do it even with HR. HR tends to be under the domain of which of those four C-suite roles.
um, COO.
Right.
I've seen them under CFO, but COO makes more sense.
Make
So,
yeah, COO is about operations. Operations is about people. So
mhm.
do we have enough people? Do we have the right people? Are they in the right locations? Do they have all the right materials? Do they have the training? All those operational sorts of things that are very much focused on making sure the business actually runs. That's the operations side of things. And we didn't necessarily talk about the C-suite. There are a lot of people involved in operations.
Mhm.
And for them to do their best job in operations, the amiable driver energy supports those operational aspects, particularly those that involve people and processes, procedures, things that impact or involve people. That's not to suggest, again, this isn't a typing system. That's not to suggest that a COO doesn't have their driven driver moments. We're just
Mhm.
talking about the task at hand. Like, for example, the expressive driver tends to be where a CEO at their essence is really all about. The CEO is about interacting with others, interacting with the media, interacting with other companies, being the face of the company. So standing in front of those audiences and delivering those motivating addresses.
That's what
Um,
I was thinking about. Yeah,
yeah, that chief executive
that
officer,
inspirational part of their job.
inspirational, the face of the company. They are the driving force energetically. Where if I look at the chairman, generally speaking, when I think chairman, I think there's a chair somewhere. And that chair is probably at a conference table. And this chairperson is surrounded by other key
Board members.
players, board members, whatever that happens to be. Why are they getting together? Are they getting together to try to figure out what operations? No, they're getting together to go like, are we making money? Are we gaining market share? Are we increasing our value? I mean, their emphasis tends to be on making sure that the investors are getting a return on that investment. Um, And it's usually the board, the chairperson of the board, who is going like, we got to find the right CEO. We need a CEO, and then they usually let the CEO find the OO or maybe the FO. But you get the idea. The driven driver is about the task. How that task comes to be, just make it happen, make it happen, make it happen. So again, I bring this out, and we'll be finishing up for today in just a second. So I just want to say, when we're working with clients, we are not working with some concrete fixed personality, some immutable creature. We are dealing with a dynamic human being capable of feeling and expressing every single possibility in the full range available in humans' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So we've got to be willing to be more in the moment. And when I'm talking about the moment, I'm not just talking about time, I'm talking energetically. We've got to be able to recognize where they are energetically about a particular activity, and then work with that energy to help that client to understand those energies sufficiently to know whether or not the ideal energy is the one they are currently experiencing or not, and then support them as they move to that more beneficial place energetically. We could talk about all 16 of them. We will not be doing that. We have an enhancement program that you all have access to, that is the Change Grid layer by layer. It goes into these 16 energies in detail. Just know that it's going to be very straightforward, because we'll talk about primary energy and secondary energy. As we do start reading Change Grids, and actually the last 3 of the lessons really talking about Change Grids, what the Change Grids are sharing, how to use that information most effectively with a client, and actually use this again. It's a conversational tool. I don't need a Change Grid to tell me that a client is experiencing a driven driver energy around a particular activity. So it's most important to us that you understand that these diagrams we're showing you are not what's important. The tool is not what's important. What's important is that you understand that every human being has a change grid inside of their head. And the one that's inside of their head has got all these locations scattered all over it. And these diagrams are just simple graphic representations of what those range of possibilities are, so that you can become more sensitive to what's going on energetically with a client and use that insight to help them most effectively. So we'll talk about the others as we start to read grids. This just wanted to let you know this layer, these 16 energies do exist, and they can become very powerful insights to share with a client. Questions, comments? Okay, then your next step will be to participate in the discussion session for lesson 5. During the discussion session, Dave will be leading a dialogue, a conversation with the faculty members and senior members of the ChangeWorks community, so they can talk about how these layers we've talked about in the Change Grid, talk about the danger zones, talk about these 16 energies, and how they actually prove to be very useful, practical, powerful tools of insight for their clients. So with that, thank you all very much for joining in. Talk to you next time. Bye for now.